Thanksgiving is almost here, and I've been promising for weeks that we're really going to take a deep dive into the holiday of Thanksgiving. And I'm not talking about the celebration and the turkey and the getting together with family. I'm talking about the story, the myth, and the history of Thanksgiving. It's 24 billion stories, and that's what we're talking about today. I've been struggling with the best way to start this, and I think the best way to start this is just to tell the Thanksgiving story as I remember hearing it as a child. Now, some of the terminology I learned as a child, I no longer use today. I don't think it's appropriate. I'm going to tell the story, though, the way I learned it as a child. And the way I learned it was this, that there were a group of people from Europe called the Pilgrims, these people that had been suffering under religious persecution, coming to the New World as they thought of it and as they understood it, that had been discovered, as they believed, by Christopher Columbus. And they landed in the New World, somewhere in the neighborhood of Plymouth Rock. They had a really tough time of it, but the locals there, the Indians, as they called them, came to help them through that first winter. They survived the winter, and in the fall of the following year, at the harvest time, they had a great celebration and a great feast, and the Pilgrims were there with their whole families, and the Indians came, and they celebrated this meal together, and it was a wonderful time of peace and unity and harmony between the Pilgrims, the new settlers, the colonists, and the locals, the Indians who were there. That's the story that I heard. A little later on, I learned that Thanksgiving wasn't officially a holiday until many years later in 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln declared it a holiday. And that also was a celebrated thing that I learned, that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, the man who set the slaves free and led the Union to the victory in the Civil War, thus preserving the Union, established Thanksgiving as a national holiday, a time for us to remember our roots in common, have a common history and a common shared memory, and celebrate that together at a time that we call Thanksgiving. Those were the stories that I heard and that I learned as I was growing up. What I have learned in the past few years, though, is that those stories really are, in many respects, just stories. Not in the sense that some of the events didn't really happen, but in the sense that they're mythological stories. They take some true events and wrap them in this mythological nature and mythological character to make them seem perhaps more and different than they really were. So I began to learn this mythological side of Thanksgiving when I first started hearing people protesting about the holiday of Thanksgiving. And I would think, my goodness, why would anyone protest Thanksgiving? Who is opposed to giving thanks? Who is opposed to getting together and celebrating with gratitude the blessings and the wonderful things we've received from previous years? Well, I haven't met a lot of folks that are opposed to gratitude. But I have come to understand more and more the viewpoint of many of those who have trouble and take issue with the holiday of Thanksgiving. And to understand that, we need to get past the myth, we need to get past the whitewash, we need to get past the stories and get to the history, not just of the Pilgrims who came not to a new world, but to a world that had been lived in for thousands of years by people already. A world and a place that the indigenous folks here called Turtle Island, that the Pilgrims and the colonists and colonizers renamed America, North America. We need to get to that history, and also to the history of the creation of Thanksgiving as a holiday. That's going to take a minute. It's going to take a little bit of effort. And I want to let you know right up front where a major source of my understanding is coming from. And it's coming from a book by Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah called Unsettling Truths. Mark Charles is in fact a Native American. Soong-Chan Rah is a Korean American, and they've written this book. It was published in 2019, just about a year ago. And its title is perfectly descriptive. It is a book of unsettling truths, not just about the history of Turtle Island, aka North America, but also about the history of the church for about the past 1,500 years. The truths are indeed unsettling, and they do not match up with much of the mythology that I was taught and that I learned growing up. So we're going to dive into that in just a very small way in this video. I strongly encourage you to go to Amazon.com and get the book Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah. So let's get to the history. So yeah, the Pilgrims were real. They were fleeing religious persecution first from England. They went from England to the Netherlands. Then things weren't great in the Netherlands, so they came to what they called the New World that they thought of as being discovered by Columbus. Mark Charles points out quite reasonably that you can't discover someplace that is already inhabited. There were already people here. The indigenous folks of North America had been here for thousands of years. They had long histories here of being stewards of this land long before Europeans came here and began to colonize. But the Pilgrims came, believing themselves to be coming to, quote, a new world, and that their arrival here was part of a divine blessing from God. They saw themselves as being inheritors of God's promise to the nation of Israel. When God led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, He promised them land. He promised them territory and prosperity in that territory. And the Pilgrims felt the same way about the land they were coming to, that God was promising them this land. That meant they had to push out the people that were already here. The Pilgrims came. That first winter was in fact very, very hard. The local natives, the indigenous people that were from various tribes of the Wampanoag peoples, did in fact help them through. They established a treaty with the Wampanoag people that lasted for 50 years until it was broken. And here's the thing, I've read some articles recently of people saying, wow, that's pretty amazing. They had a treaty and they kept it and they didn't break it for 50 years. Let me ask you this. If you were married for 50 years and then your spouse cheated on you, would you say, wow, that was pretty good, we made it 50 years? Or would you really be distressed and upset and broken by the fact that the agreement, the treaty, the vows had been broken? So the Pilgrims came. The Wampanoag people helped them through that first winter. There was some sort of celebration, whether it was planned or whether it was kind of a happenstance and just came up. We don't really know the details of. But we do know this, that within 50 years, the white colonists were breaking their treaties with the indigenous peoples. And that was just among the first of the treaties that were broken and the agreements that were broken, as the long and painful and horrifying history of colonial and then American expansion into the territories and the lands of the indigenous peoples of North America as that progressed. Fast forward a few hundred years. It's now 1863, and in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declares that the final Thursday in November be celebrated as a national day of Thanksgiving. It sounds like a good thing. It sounds like a way to try to unify the nation, right? In the midst of civil war, a way to try to look at and celebrate what we have to be thankful for in the middle of horrifying circumstances. But when we expand the view a little bit, it doesn't look quite so beautiful. Let's zoom back a little bit, widen our focus, and see the circumstances that surround Lincoln's proclamation of a national day of Thanksgiving. Now, to get this, I'm going to read directly from Charles and Rah's book, Unsettling Truths. In October of 1863, just a few months after the removal of the Dakota people was completed, President Lincoln issued a proclamation for the final Thursday of November to be commemorated as a national day of Thanksgiving. In his proclamation, he acknowledged the death and violence against white people and by white people in the Civil War, but regarding the War of Discovery and Manifest Destiny, that is, regarding the wars with the indigenous peoples, by which the United States government was expanding its territory from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, Lincoln said this, quote, "Needful diversions of wealth and of strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not stopped, have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe had enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well of iron and coal as of precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore," end quote, from Lincoln, continuing to quote from the book. According to this statement, Lincoln viewed westward expansion through an optimistic and positive expression that focused on the assumed triumph of an exceptional people. He failed to recognize how those very policies meant the annihilation of entire people groups. Lincoln's policy toward Native Americans revealed a social imagination of white supremacy. White settlers had preeminence over the long-term claims of the indigenous population. The U.S. government possessed the right of discovery, expansion, and disposition with minimal consideration of the genocidal impact on Native people. Now, you might think, if you're like me, when I was first learning this stuff, you might think that word genocide is too strong a word. Is it really the right word? I mean, is genocide, that's what the Nazis did to the Jews, right? That was an attempt at genocide in Nazi Germany. Yeah, that is what the Nazis did to the Jews. And it is the right word to describe how we have treated the indigenous people, the native nations to Turtle Island, now known as North America. I'm going to continue to quote from Unsettling Truths. Throughout the fall and winter of 1863, on the orders of General Carleton, U.S. Army, now the orders of General Carleton, Abraham Lincoln is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. All of this was done under his leadership and under his authority. U.S. Army officer Kit Carson began ethnically cleansing the Navajo people from the territory of New Mexico. His orders were that, quote, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo. That was a reservation which was more of a prison and more, in fact, of a death camp. Go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. Within 3 years of signing the first Pacific Railway Act in 1862, within 3 years, by 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had ethnically cleansed the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, the Cheyenne and Arapaho from Colorado and Wyoming, and the Navajo and some Apache from the territory of New Mexico. The expansion of the Americas could now progress unimpeded. Abraham Lincoln's actions, both direct and indirect, resulted in the ongoing and intentional genocide of the native peoples. Native lives did not matter to Abraham Lincoln. Again, if you think those words are strong, then just listen to the numbers. In 1492, at the start of the War of Discovery and Manifest Destiny, we will estimate the native population of the lower continental United States in the year 1500 to be 6 million people. Between 1492 and 1900, the estimated population of the indigenous peoples in the continental United States dropped to 237,000. That gives the War of Discovery a 96% rate of genocide, i.e. 96% of the native population was wiped out during the ongoing war. Now, just from the period of 1800 to 1900, often referred to as the century of expansion, the indigenous population of Turtle Island was depleted from 600,000 to 237,000, giving the War of Discovery and Manifest Destiny a genocide rate of 60%. And from 1860 to 1870, the decade which included the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, the actual number in the census of off-reservation, tax-paying, assimilated American Indians living in the United States fell from 44,000 to 25,713, a decrease of 41%. Nearly half of that drop came from the population in New Mexico, where Abraham Lincoln marched 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children to what for nearly a quarter of them was a death camp, which he approved, called Bosque Redondo. By comparison, Nazi Germany had a genocide rate for the Jewish people of 35%. Did you hear that? During the decade in which Abraham Lincoln was president, the genocide rate of the native indigenous peoples of North America was 41%. In Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, the genocide rate of the Jewish people was 35%. 6% more killed by the United States government under Abraham Lincoln than Jews killed by Hitler in Nazi Germany. No, genocide is not too strong a word. Do you see now why some people, particularly Native Americans, would find the Thanksgiving celebration obnoxious, perhaps even offensive? A holiday of gratitude proclaimed by a president who killed 44% of their people. Do you see why people might find that to be something less than celebratory? I told you, the title of the book is apt and accurate, Unsettling Truths. These kind of truths are deeply, deeply disturbing. At least I hope they're deeply disturbing. Now, maybe they're not for you. Maybe this is all old news to you and you've heard this all before and you understand it. But you know, I grew up with a very different story of Thanksgiving and a very, very different story of colonization, a very different story of westward growth. I grew up with the glories of manifest destiny and a new promised land and America to be a city on a hill like Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 5. But Jesus never ordained or blessed implicitly or explicitly a Christian empire or genocide or even the pursuit of territorial growth for the church, particularly not at the cost of genocide against people he lived and died for, people he created, people made in his image. And it's one thing to say we all have things to be grateful for, and we should take time and be grateful and celebrate those, and that's a good thing. I'm not telling you to stop celebrating Thanksgiving. I'm just saying if we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving, we need to know the context of this holiday. We need to know where it came from. We need to see that it originated in the midst of a genocidal war against the people who already lived in the land discovered by Christopher Columbus. So what do we do with these unsettling truths? Where do we go from here? How do we respond? These are good questions. Right now, we're going to end this video. I'm going to invite you to take some time. It won't be enough time, but take some time to really reflect on these horrifying, disturbing, unsettling truths. Let these truths unsettle you. Let them disturb you. Let them shake some of the foundations on which your identity, your national identity, even your Christian identity rest. Take time for that to happen. Take time to allow yourself to feel bad, even really, really bad, before we even start talking about what can we do and where can we go. We've got to see the unsettling truths, and we've got to allow ourselves to be horrified by those things. No matter how disruptive that is to us emotionally and spiritually, politically and religiously. So take a few days, take a few, hopefully more than a few hours. But over the next few days, before the next video comes out, you might even want to wait longer than that before watching the next video. Let these unsettling truths sink in and disturb you to the core. Because until that happens, I don't believe there is a way forward.